born free.
And we will die free.
The time in between, though,
that's complicated.
In that time, governments, institutions, and our egos will limit our ability to find true freedom in this life. These are real stories of real people overcoming the odds, persevering in justice, and unlocking their potential. Welcome to Finding Freedom. Here's your host, John Odermatt.
Hey, what is happening? Welcome back to another episode of Finding Freedom here on the Lions of Liberty Podcast Network. Great to have you here today. Got an awesome guest that I will introduce in just a moment. But before I do that, got something to talk about. Got something to share with you all. If you listened to my episode last week, I talked about a promotion that we're doing for the Lions of Liberty Pride. Well, that is continuing on. If you sign up as a new annual Lions of Liberty Pride member on Patreon, then you will get, after you sign up at any level, you will get this mug right here. Can you see that? It says Lions of Liberty, a nice little Christmas mug. You will also get a magnet, Lions of Liberty, and you also get this little coaster. And this is all with the help of our friend Jason over at Horrible Designs. So check him out. Does some incredible things, some really cool and funny designs you can put on mugs, t-shirts, whatever you want. So check out Jason at Horrible Designs. I'll link to that on the show notes page. And like I said, you can get that mug if you sign up to be a Lions Pride member at any level on an annual membership. Or if you convert your already monthly membership to annual. Or if you are a Mufasa level member, which is our $25 and up. So all those people will be getting mugs. I'll be sending them out probably tomorrow. So if you want a mug, you know how to do it now. All right, let's get into today's episode. I'm going to bring in my guest for today, Fergus Hodgson. And Fergus has been on my show at least once previously, maybe twice. I know he was on with Mark Claire back in the day a couple times. Fergus is the publisher of the Impunity Observer, which is a geopolitical intelligence service focused Anglo-Latin American affairs. And he's the founder of Econ Americas LLC, which specializes in alternative investments and jurisdictional arbitrage. Fergus was born in New Zealand, now lives in the States, out in Colorado. He's lived in 7 countries. He's traveled extensively across Latin America. He has an MBA from Rice University. He wrote a book which came out earlier this year called Financial Sovereignty for Canadians. And he has another book which just came out, which we're going to be talking about today, called The Latin American Red Pill, which details his search for freedom south of the border. Fergus, welcome back to Finding Freedom.
I really appreciate the opportunity, John. I really want to speak with the audience, but mainly it's like catching up with an old friend because I've listened to your show for so long, and all the other shows too, Mark Claire and Brian McWilliams. So I just respect the journey that you guys have been on, and it's wonderful to see you kind of like flowering in your own lives, basically, developing, getting as we get older. And so I kind of relate to a lot of what you guys have spoken about over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking about that pre-show, how, we've been in this liberty movement, this freedom movement for, well over a decade, and we've grown up and we've made mistakes and we've changed a lot of our views. I don't think we've changed our principles really, but we've kind of changed the way we relate our principles to the world, the way we would apply our principles to the world, I should say. And I think it's interesting that this new book you have, a lot of these articles, I think you said you started, some of them are from 2014, some from are much more recently were written for the book. But you've gone through this journey as you were traveling through South America and having all of these experiences, learning about the people, learning about the culture, learning about the politics. You didn't get an education in South America in a classroom. You got it on the ground, which is pretty unique. So before we talk about the book, let's get some more background on you, on your travels in South America. Anything else you want to share with the audience to tee up the discussion?
Well, yeah, just like you, as you say, and we're speaking to a more libertarian or liberty-oriented audience, which is great. That I came to college in the United States about 20 years ago. And so at the time, I was just infatuated by third-party debates, and that's where I became familiar with the Libertarian Party. And just like you, I guess the whole Ron Paul era, I'm kind of like a child of that era.
Mm-hmm.
And I devoted my life to it to a large degree. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think back now how much of a dreamer I was. And I literally, like, the subtitle is not hyperbole. I was searching for freedom around the world, especially in Latin America. And, we just like you said, I don't think our principles really have changed. I feel like we're just a bit older and I hope wiser. We've been jaded. We've kind of been through the works. And I was mentioning to you before the show how it's kind of fascinating to look back now that we share our content with the newbies in the domain, and how often they will chastise us. It's kind of a bizarre reality, but it happens. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Young people don't like to be told that they're wrong. And, like us, when you stumble across this new philosophy, that it really does fill in a lot of gaps that I know I had in my education growing up. I think there's a time period for a lot of people where you've answered the questions. All right, no more questions. Let's just stick with the foundation, this new foundation that we've laid here.
Well, one of the, I mean, just if we can stay on this libertarian movement a little bit, one of the chief insights I realized is that a lot of people will approach the political philosophy in an unhealthy fashion and focus on, let's say, the problems of the state, of which there are infinite problems, basically, and rather than address their own shortcomings, they almost deflect a focus on their own irresponsibility or lack whatever shortcomings they have. And I had a few run-ins with this years ago. I was keen to be a part of the Free State Project up in New Hampshire, and I don't know how closely you followed that, but they used, and probably they still have this. One of the Free Staters used to have this thing called Taproom Tuesdays in Manchester.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I drove up there and got to meet the Free State Project participants and thought, man, I hate to say it, but most of their lives were a mess. And it just made me realize that you've got to fix your own life before you try to go off and save the world. And at the time, there was a lady there who had been part of a topless protest, an open carry topless protest in New Hampshire.
That's the most libertarian thing ever.
Yeah. And so I won't say her name, but basically she was overdrawn on all her debit or credit cards, had no money. So I basically had to buy her dinner.
Yeah.
And the irony to the story is that the police did take her in because people were calling the cops. There's this topless lady with a gun on her side walking down the street. But then the cops just let her go because there wasn't actually a rule against what she was doing. So she was protesting a rule that didn't even exist. It's so... Yeah. So
you're just protesting against, what people don't want to see their children to see, basically, even though there's no law against it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. So we can kind of just dig into the book here. In the chapter where you talk about your travels from Colombia to Chile and traveling by bus, one thing that you highlight in the book, which I thought was pretty fascinating, is how a lot of people in South America, they put this trust in all of this emotion is tied up in their political candidates. And I think there's some overlap there to what you were just talking about with libertarians and how much energy we put into changing things through this political process. And, if we can just get the right ideas out there, if we can just get the right people communicating the ideas, if the right person like Dave Smith can run for president, then we can change things. And maybe there's a little parallel there between this belief that a lot of people in South America are putting in these more, it's a little different. It's more, they're going the authoritarian socialist route. But do you see any parallels there?
I do. And for those, let's say the younger generation of libertarians who are listening to this, I strongly encourage you to consider, let's say, the findings of public choice economics, which suggest or lead one to believe that there's this kind of emergent system of government, and that there are all sorts of players involved. So it's a broader system that can't just be easily undone. It's like you can just pull the cord out. Mm-hmm. And so there are all sorts of players manifest in government, and therefore accepting some kind of savior, you're most expecting someone to overturn all the incentives that are embedded in this institution or this kind of complex network. And no one can do that. It's basically beyond any one man to achieve that. So I'm not saying there's zero merit in any kind of political candidate, but the complexity of this, broader governmental system, which is explained, or it's one of the topic of public choice economics. It's how can I put it? There are underlying incentives that drive people to push in certain directions, and it's hard to undo all those incentives, in one fell swoop or through one candidate. And I remember just over Thanksgiving, I was chatting with a friend of mine who is I think a school superintendent, a school district superintendent, and he was saying, well, the citizens voted for us, right? They gave us the permission to do this. And I thought, oh, whoa, buddy. and then he said, what he also said, and I don't want to beat up on him, he's a great, I like him, but he just said that, well, the schools, they evolved to be this way. It wasn't just an accident. I said, well, yes, there are people who want to get their pensions, right? There are vested interests in this. Yeah. It's not like it wasn't from the parents. There were the political kind of cronies in this process. And so, yes, it did evolve. I agree with you, but not in the way that I would want it to be, right? And so that's why you've got these vested interests who will fight you just tooth and nail when you push in a certain direction or resist what they really want. And that, especially in the public school system, of course, which he works with, their sense of entitlement is just enormous. Further, I was kind of shocked because this guy describes himself as a conservative, but he basically opposes the idea of shutting the federal Department of Education. And I was going, I was kind of losing it, because he just said that, well, if you close it, you won't have that kind of tool in your toolbox to make the changes. Like if you want to change schools, this is one tool at your disposal. And I thought, well, I don't want anyone to have such a tool. So that's my basic take on it. But yeah, like I said, the point was just that there are all sorts of players, even including in government education, notably teacher unions, who benefit from the status quo, and they will resist, they will fight you. Now, in terms of Latin America, the reason why I brought up that point, and I call it an anti-capitalist mentality, because when I went, one of the few stereotypes I had was that Latin America is a home of corruption, and that, let's say, the politicians are bought off by narcos or whatever, which is largely true. And I thought, well, wouldn't that mean that no one would respect them and no one would expect anything from them or have any optimism for it? But it was almost the opposite, that people, they were really engaged in the political process. They were super interested in it. And I just found that peculiar. And further, I was, even back then, what is this, 2010, I was strongly libertarian or anarcho-capitalist at the time. And I just found myself basically the odd one out. And whereas here, say in the United States, I would find many more kindred spirits. Yeah.
So during that trip, you said that it was like 2010 timeframe when you're taking that. Was that when you were taking the trip around from Colombia to Chile?
Yeah. So I went back to New Zealand for a wedding, and I think December or January 2009, and then January 2010, I flew all the way to Colombia, and I just didn't know where I was going. I didn't really have a plan. I just got a bus, and then I ran out of money, so I flew back to the United States to start working. Yeah. So
one thing I'm curious about, because you talk about the crime in the book that you witnessed, both I guess indirectly and directly. How much of a surprise was it to you? Because like one thing in the States, and I think maybe it's not overblown, but I think there's this sentiment in the United States that if you travel to Mexico or you travel to, name almost any Latin American country, that, if you go downtown at night, you'll get shot. Like, so could you kind of give some, more of a detailed explanation of the variance of the levels of crime? And, there's nicer areas, I'm sure, and terrible areas, right?
Yeah. So I got to be frank with you. Americans have more experience with Latin America because it's on the border, right? I didn't grow up here. I grew up in New Zealand, so we have almost no relationship at all. So because back in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up, I mean, maybe you would have gotten some Mexican food at the supermarket if you really looked for it. But in general, there wasn't. The only real kind of relations we'd have with Latin America was we might play Argentina and rugby or something like that. But there was pretty much nothing. And I remember when I came to the US in the early 2000s, and I thought, this Mexican food, what the heck is this? It's great, right? So, but I still think it's great. But anyway, so I didn't have the same intuition that Americans might, that this place is super dangerous. And even if people had told me that it was more dangerous, I had never really suffered crime in my entire life. So crime wasn't really a thought to me. People would say things, but I didn't really, I think it just kind of bounced off me because I was so naive. But that naivety is gone. Because the thing is that, I mean, if I think about the United States, I don't know if I do have one kind of anecdote of a crime I've experienced or witnessed, but in general, it's almost nothing after 20 odd years here. But if you live in Latin America, I mean, they're just so I said in the book that the official estimates are that Latin America has 5 times the murder rate of the United States and Canada on a weighted average basis. Yeah. And my personal view is that it could easily be 10 times that rate probably misses a lot of the action. Because, and one of the chapters I have here is an anonymous interview with a federal law enforcement official in Venezuela. And I discussed with him what does he think of the official numbers? And he just says they're a joke, basically, that we have all these people dying that no one reports them. And there are all these, like, even the part of it, the story is that in Venezuela, even the police will go out and basically murder a gang themselves because they're so afraid of them. They're like, let's take the initiative and do it before they start killing us. And so it's like a war zone in that place. So my personal view is that Latin America has at least 5 times the murder rate, probably much higher than that. But that's just the start, because not all crimes are murder, of course. A lot of it is just petty crime. I mean, so for example, friends of mine in Ecuador got drugged when they went out, and then they woke up with basically $20 and all the rest of their money taken from them. And
at least I left him $20.
Yeah, I know. They're just like, we're not going to totally destroy you. Like, and so, but I mean, it's just like I said. There are many stories. I've witnessed crime firsthand. I mean, my buddy got held up at gunpoint in Ecuador. I mean, it's just part of the daily life. And so so what can I say about the level of crime? I just think that we take it for granted in, let's say, more peaceful parts of the United States or New Zealand, where I'm from, that crime just isn't really a part of our lives. I mean, even when I was growing up, maybe a house in town might have gotten burgled now and again, but That's about it. And but that's just a luxury, and that's one of the real red pills of my experience, that I don't know the entire world. I haven't been everywhere, of course, but I realized that it's really nice to live in the first world.
I love having you on the show because I pick up new words I can use, like
Yeah.
burgled.
Yeah. Oh, Americans say burglarized, right? Which sounds weird.
I like that better, though. I think burgled is better.
Yeah. So
we should switch.
Because I just think that the level of dysfunction in the third world is beyond what most Americans can comprehend. And crime is just the start. Crime is just the start. And just recently, and this one kind of breaks my heart, but I watched a documentary, which I recommend in this film, called La Bestia. And it's a friend of mine made it. It's kind of like an up close and personal documentary about the people who try to travel through Mexico to get to the United States, right?
Mm-hmm.
And La Bestia refers to the network of trains. So these people just jump on top of the trains and try to get their way to the United States. So this is a genius plan, of course. So half of them fall off and break their legs or lose their limbs, and they get stuck. Almost everyone gets robbed, and all the women get raped. And I just thought, there's just this ugly side of the world that we just don't have to deal with, and kind of take for granted that we don't have to deal with it. And that other people, they just accepted it. It's just one of the most bizarre elements of that film was hearing a lady being interviewed as she was getting nearer to the U.S. border, saying, "Well, yes, they raped us, but we're all okay." And I was going, "Oh, okay, yeah."
So one thing you talk about in the book, and we'll jump around some, but I think you wrote the book in that way that people can just jump around to different chapters.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah.
Pick it up wherever you want.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, and I think it's one of your more controversial chapters is on IQ.
Yeah.
And I think one aspect of the immigration that has been happening into the United States that is not being talked about is, the people that are the areas that are being emigrated from, right? Those areas that are losing generations of people coming to the United States, that are losing, some of the most intelligent, smartest people who are leaving for an opportunity, for a chance. They're willing to jump on the top of a train rather than, stay in the, maybe dangerous situations where they're living. And it's just so fascinating to me. And I'm sure there's a reason for it, that from our legacy media and our politicians in the United States, we only hear the one side of it. We just hear of the people who are coming. You don't hear about what's happening on the other side.
So what I mean about the hollowing out of these countries?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a strange thing, because people who immigrate, it's not a random sample of a country, right? Immigrants tend to be, predictably, those who are more likely to take initiative. They tend to more be male. They tend to be more intelligent than the general population of their home country. Because I hate to say it, but the Bestia, that's a crazy example, of course, trying to climb on the train, but you've got to be tougher and more resilient or whatever to just leave your country and not have that natural network to fall back on. Now, what has happened in Central America from all this migration is that it's almost like an exoskeleton, and that it's like a country living outside the country. And about 20 to 30% of the economy of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras is remittances now.
Really?
Yeah. So about almost a third of the economy there is just people sending money back from the United States. And
that's wild.
Yeah, and so it is strange, because you know that the salaries they're earning there. So I tell people that, let's say the GDP per capita in Latin America is about $500 a month, and if you make more than $1,000 a month, you're basically middle class or educated class. And you go to a city. I went to Tegucigalpa in Honduras maybe 6 months ago, and the the shopping mall is packed. And someone said to me, this wouldn't even exist if not for the remittances coming back from the United States. So it's a very strange reality. And you can always say, and I don't know whether you have any Irish in your background, but in some ways the Irish have had this, and it's a real, in my view, it's a deep sadness for the Irish people that so many of their best left a hollowed out country back in Ireland. And not only that, but all the next generations basically missed out on enjoying the community or the culture that had been, accumulated over many centuries. So,
Yeah, I think a really fascinating element of it. I mean, talking about the types of people who leave. So if you want to look at it from an entrepreneurial standpoint, the types of people who would take risks inside your country to start a business, to try to build something, to try to innovate, those are the types of people who are the same types of people who would take that risk to leave, to start over somewhere else. So it really, it is a hollowing out, and I think it's extremely sad. And when we look forward 10, 20 years from now, what are these countries going to look like in Latin America?
Well, we don't have to look forward. We already have examples. So, because the current immigration to the United States, I mean, now it's just everywhere. I mean, this whole Biden era, it's just been like, the dam has burst. But during the last, let's say, 20 years, it's been Venezuelans, Central Americans in particular, right? Like I said, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Venezuela, which has had the most severe crisis. Obviously, Cubans have kind of been dripping the whole time. But there were pronounced periods of exoduses, if that can be a plural, from Nicaragua in the 1970s, 80s, and Cuba, 60s, 70s. And we can look at those countries now, and it is brutal to see that their level of poverty is hard for Americans to comprehend. Because, I mean, especially in the case of Cuba, all their best people left, I mean, decades ago. I mean, there's just no natural aristocracy left. And the one gentleman, Oswaldo Paya, who was, I guess, one of the last, let's say, decent gentlemen who just really wanted to had some kind of credibility, and he gathered signatures for an open democratic election, and he got murdered by the regime, he and his driver. So his daughter had to flee Cuba and lives in Miami, and between Miami and New York now. But so you have these countries that are insanely poor, and oddly enough, there's a kind of stability to that. It's almost like they're kind of stuck, and there's just nothing much happens there. There's not really the vibrance or like you said, there's not the kind of entrepreneurial activity so much. People are just surviving. And one of the awkward elements too, though, it might sound good that these people are immigrants. They're kind of go-getters. They take initiative and they're smarter. There's a problem though, because they're not going to a stable environment. It's very unpredictable. So they'll look to, when you're an immigrant, unfortunately, unless you have, let's say, a religious community or something, there's a tendency to be kind of like make a quick buck, or kind of like almost be dishonest in dealings. And if you go to a place like Miami, you see this, where there's a lot of showiness and dishonesty. It's not a kind of a place that I would want to be frank, because that is where it's a very transient environment. And so there's not the ability to set clear contracts and build for the long term. So yes, these people will be go-getters and aggressive or whatever, but it's not necessarily a healthy addition.
Yeah. And that element of, dressing flashy, showing wealth, that was something else you experienced in Latin America with people who maybe, got good jobs with foreign companies that came in. In the oil industry. You remember that story?
Right? Yeah. So I outlined 5 broad, let's say, attributes of Latin America, and crime, poverty, class division, anti-capitalism, and low trust. And the low trust is the last, because I see low trust as almost like a product of all the previous ones. But it is the case that so much of Latin American society lives basically at subsistence. I mean, if you're making $500 a month, I mean, let's just say you're not going to become a millionaire anytime soon, right? I mean, you're just surviving for the next generation and just trying to stick in there. And so when there is so little kind of surplus above subsistence, people who have that surplus are naturally going to be sought after. They're going to be popular. I just noted there was one example, these little tidbits of observations, that in Patagonia, when I lived a year in Argentina, that yes, it is true that foreign companies tend to pay better. That's why a lot of the vilification of foreign companies is so foolish, because they actually offer much better work treatment and compensation. But the workers in the oil or the extraction industries of southern Argentina, they would wear special jackets. It's like having a varsity jacket at college, and it would just be like a magnet for the ladies. And I just thought that was one little anecdote that I didn't find it necessarily savory, but I just realized that it made sense that these guys, they wanted to show that they were wealthier, and the women were naturally attracted to that. And it was kind of like a simpler transaction, you might say. Yeah. And not all of it is, I don't know, unsavory like that. I note that also, even if you ignore, let's say, the inequality financially, that there's a great deal of inequality in terms of just lifestyle and education and all sorts of things in terms of behavior. So people will naturally self-segregate much more in a scenario like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, one of the reasons why I wrote this book too is that whether we like it or not, I mean, I hate to say this, but basically the US is going to be Latin America in short order.
Well, I think it'll be interesting to track because the way the U.S. is structured, we have 50 states. So
yeah,
states deal with things in different ways, right? So I think California might be the first one to become Latin America.
Well, so basically we already have Latin America in the United States in terms of Puerto Rico is absolutely part of Latin America, right?
Mm-hmm.
And New Mexico, which is the most Spanish-speaking state, was basically Spanish-speaking before, and when it joined the United States, and it's been Spanish-speaking or Hispanic the whole time. It's never really become American, in my opinion. So, and they have both Native American and Hispanic very strong populations. So it would be one of the other places that would show the attributes of Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
So it is true that the immigration of Latin America to the United States is not, it's not uniform across the country, right? So it's obviously stronger in the Southwest and Texas, and then in Florida. But if you go to, I don't know, the Pacific Northwest or to New England or whatever, there's much less. However, there's a kind of like a substantive change in that now Latin American society has gotten to a critical mass where there's really no need to integrate, right? That's why I say that if you live in places like Miami, I mean, if you're speaking English, you're in the minority, right? Mm. So also, I went to the watch party for the elections in earlier this month or in November, and there was Colorado Telemundo there, right? They've got Spanish coverage even here in Colorado. So it's changing in such a way that like I said, one of the attributes of Latin America, which is kind of maybe lost on people, is that it is a very kind of demographically mixed and confused place. And the US is becoming more like that, more like Brazil. That's just the way it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting how you point out that there's really no need to integrate. And I think that just the way with technology and our culture today, even more so, because you can find people that speak your language, even if you don't know anybody right in your neighborhood or community, which you probably do,
Yeah.
or you can find them easily now, either on Facebook or TikTok or wherever.
Right.
It's so much easier to connect with people and not having to go outside and maybe learn to speak English and go at it that way.
Yeah, and the thing, one of the politically incorrect elements of the book is just that whether we like it or not, Latin Americans do vote more left. Like that's one of the reasons why I wanted to address the topic and that's why I have the anti-capitalist element. And we touched a bit on what I observed when I was there. But of course, like I said, the group demographically is so diverse. Being Latin American, it means you're from a certain place. It doesn't mean you're a certain ethnicity necessarily. So you do have a mix, but it is clear that people who take the term Latin American, and especially the new arrivals, vote much more left or Democrat. And even the ones who tend to vote the kind of Trumpish Latinos are much more kind of populist interventionists. They would support things like a higher minimum wage or more of a crackdown on gun rights and things like that. They would be more conservative because they want extra security or things like that, rather than the kind of libertarian conservatism that you and I might lean towards, right?
Well, what do you make? And you have a chapter in the book that addresses this. Of course, it was written prior to the election, called "Why GOP Outreach is Failing Hispanics."
Yes.
What do you make of Trump doing quite well, especially looking like Miami-Dade County in Florida, where I think Biden won it by 7 or 8 points, and Trump ended up winning it this time by, I think, more than 10.
Yeah, there's a lot of detail in that chapter, and it's hard to sum it up. But basically, Republicans have lost the Hispanic vote. I think going back to maybe Ronald Reagan won it, kind of like Trump did when he just swept the floor. Yeah, and the ebbing and flowing of Republicans seems to be between about 25 and 40%. So Trump did outperform. I mean, substantially outperformed. And you can interpret that in different ways. One, you could say that we can have different views of this, that he's more of a rock star kind of populist that is appealing. You could also say that what this ebbing and flowing has seemed to follow economic trends. And since the US economy has had so many kind of challenges right now, there's been much more of a push for an alternative. I just think that this fact that I must admit, I'm actually suspicious of this exit polling, of its accuracy. I'm doubtful that he actually did get a majority of Hispanics, but let's assume that he did. I suspect that any other Republican candidate would have struggled to do that. Is it because, sorry to interrupt you, but is it because of who he was running against? Is there an element because he was running against Kamala Harris, a woman, that Hispanics would rather vote for Trump? Okay, so did you read that chapter? No, maybe.
I read it. Yeah.
Yeah. So there are a few little tidbits there. So let's be charitable to Trump and the GOP here for a second, right? And so first, Trump has shown that a strict immigration enforcement mandate or agenda does not scare away Hispanics in general. Some of them it does, but they're kind of split on this. It's not a clear, like there's this assumption that they just all want, I guess, amnesty for 30 million people or something like that, and that's not the case.
Right.
So he showed that it's not immigration that really is the carrot. Also, he showed that if you offer a kind of like an opportunity to get out of the welfare state, a lot of people find that appealing. So on the other hand, there is this weird rainbow coalition that I guess the Democratic Party has pursued since giving up on the white working class of America. So now they've become kind of like hateful. I don't know what the term is, condescending towards just kind of like working class or poor or white Americans. They've tried to kind of cuddle together this odd coalition that really doesn't have that much in common. Like they've got the LGBT faction in general, and then they've got maybe Muslims and who the heck knows what? All these kind of like quote unquote minorities, right?
And they have all the suburban soccer moms.
Exactly. And feminists, women who don't want to get married, you know. So, but it is the case that Latin Americans are less politically correct and do think on an ethnic basis. And insofar as they see Blacks or African Americans in competition with them, they don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
So the more you talk about things like reparations for slavery, the more you just turn them right off. So I do touch upon this in the book, the way that there's a tension there in trying to keep this coalition together. And presumably the Democrats, by pushing a Black woman, really tested that coalition, right? Or quote unquote Black woman, however you want to define her. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, how towards the end of the campaign, I think when the Harris campaign realized, wow, we're probably going to lose this, they brought in Barack Obama, and Barack Obama started speaking directly to Black men, making promises, which I think backfired in his face in many ways from the Black community, but maybe also, like you were just talking about there, maybe also from the Hispanic community as well, who kind of took offense to that. Why are you talking to them and not to us?
Well, that's basically what's happening, that you have now a demographic of Hispanics that outnumber Blacks in the United States, and probably want to see themselves as more politically influential or important. And there is that weird kind of conflict there. In the book, I discuss two reasons why I think, you know, the case of Trump is the exception that proves the rule, that almost any election in a Hispanic dominated area goes Democrat. It's just the way it is. And my personal view is that if that were not the case, Democrats would immediately fall out of love with the idea of letting all the immigrants in, right? If they thought the immigrants were going to be, you know, gun-toting Trump supporters, they would just they want to build the wall themselves, right? But I make the claim that Latin America lacks not entirely, but in general, they don't have the classical liberal traditions. And in fact, yes, the US gave up slavery. I don't know. I mean, in general, you know, about 200 years ago, there are like different points when it was changing, but Latin America had basically a peasant system, and even some remnants of that exist to this day. And I just think that had a deeply unfortunate effect on the psyche of the people. So they didn't have the same kind of like sense of self-ownership or self-rule that Americans have had. Second, because Latin Americans, especially when they arrive, are poorer, predictably, they just go right into the welfare state. And it is the case, and people don't really talk about this as much anymore. They used to say it was almost a good thing. Oh, they get to utilize all the welfare state, but then they realize, oh, well, that's going to get locals annoyed. But it is the case that they're more dependent on welfare. And I identify the welfare state as the real carrot that the Democratic Party has offered to get Latin Americans or Hispanics to vote for them. Now, if Republicans can get Hispanics wealthier somehow, that would really shift the axis in favor of the Republican Party, but it wouldn't overcome the sort of lack of, let's say, constitutional conservatism, which basically doesn't exist in Latin America. It's just not a thing.
Well, and hopefully you can go a little past our 45 minutes, because there's more I want to talk about. But so just to dig down a little bit more into the last election and what happened there, and just the Latin American vote in general. So when you point this out in the book, that Hispanics typically earn more money with less formal education than African Americans, than
and
blacks
Native Americans, although I didn't
and
add
Native
that, but
Americans.
yeah.
And because of that, they're not going in academia. They're not getting that indoctrination. So the left doesn't have that pulley, that way to infiltrate their brain.
This is another, like, so in my view, like I said, if you were to give amnesty, that would be almost more than the Republican Party could handle. Like, it's just too much to process. Like, even any kind of genius campaign or whatever cannot overcome that just avalanche of leftist voters.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are opportunities. Like I said, if you can get Hispanics, the more that get, let's say, over $50,000 in income, the more they'll vote Republican, because they will suddenly not be on welfare and see that as a problem, like a drain away from it. But I note also, which I think is a little bit of a gem of an idea, that all this push for things like student loan forgiveness does not benefit Hispanics, and they tend to be less interested in formal education and more interested in just going out and making their own money, right? So the more we, not me personally, but let's say people in public office, push this kind of like affirmative action for them to get them into graduate school or whatever, the more they're just not listening to them. Like, they're trying to impose or project onto them what I guess middle-class whites want, supposedly. And that's where I think Hispanics in particular, it would be they're another demographic that wouldn't appreciate the rising, I don't know whether parasitism is the word, but the rising tax recipient base that is surrounded with that higher education has, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why Republicans haven't seized upon this, because it seems like it's a pretty clear statistic that has been well known. But it's an opportunity where, especially when it comes to things like student loan forgiveness, this is just an outright transfer away from Hispanics to basically, I hate to say, but middle-class women, white women. Yeah, because they're the ones who hold the most student debt.
Yeah.
So, and that I one thing that has frustrated me in the current scenario is that this whole student loan forgiveness is just this kind of like dangled carrot. We'll just forgive a little bit. It's kind of like, we want to keep it here just so you keep voting for us. We're like, we won't actually cancel it properly. We'll just kind of dangle it there so you'll kind of keep dependent on us. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they can't cancel it entirely, because then what happens to the higher education system? If it all of a sudden it's all free, the whole model will fall apart.
Well, I mean, you could just forgive all the student loans and it would just come back 5 years later and you would have another $1 trillion in debt. I mean, so.
Yeah, I guess it would just be a cycle. Then everyone would just expect it again and again and again.
Yeah, because the fundamental problem, and you know this, John, mate, you focus on just personal education and entrepreneurship, but it's just that the more you subsidize something, right, the more you dilute its value and make it, ubiquitous. And that's what's happened to higher education, of course. And now we're all trying to show off. And in order to show off, you now need a PhD from a top 20 school or something. Anything less than that, and no one cares.
Speaking of that, I do want to touch on this because I thought it was interesting. Your experience in Latin America, what was the name of the college? UFM.
Francisco Marroquin University, or Universidad Francisco Marroquin. Yeah.
Yeah, where everyone in your class was cheating, and nobody stopped it. It was just kind of ingrained in the culture.
Yeah, it was. And it's just so funny looking back at this, John, because I guess I still had some idealism or kind of, naivety in me at that time. Because when that story came out, most people just looked at me funny, like, didn't you know this? Like, what's wrong with you? And the bit that was weird too, so basically, yeah, so I we've all gone in different directions in our lives, and I thought I wanted to work in traditional finance, and I do write about finance a lot these days. I've kind of pivoted to some degree in that direction, but I thought I needed to get a graduate degree in finance, which you don't have to do that if you want. You can find other ways into it. But I found a dual degree program with Tulane University, which I thought was prestigious, and Francisco Marroquin in Guatemala. And I just moved to Guatemala and started the program. And
Had you been to
I,
Guatemala before that?
yeah,
Yeah.
many times. Yeah, and I'd been to the university too, so I had friends there. So I started the program, and basically I just got a wake up call that everyone was cheating. It was a joke to me, kind of a bad joke, really. Like, it wasn't kind of a happy joke, but and then what I think made it much worse, that really rubbed salt into the wound, was that I and maybe maybe I was just foolish for doing this, but I basically brought this to the attention of the dean of the business school, of the rector of the university, so the top guy at the university, because
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of like an outlier. There was this kind of this random Anglo or gringo hanging out at the university, going, what is this guy doing here, basically? And then because very few Americans would go to a Spanish language program, graduate school in Guatemala. I mean, so they were aware of me, and I think they were kind of like worried that I was going to rock the boat, or just kind of unsettle the situation. And so, but I met with the president of the university and the dean of the business school, and pretty quickly, the president of the university, or rector, or whatever his title was, he wasn't so much involved. It wasn't really his kind of. He had a lot of things going on. But the dean of the business school, I think he pretty much realized that this guy is creating problems for me. Right, this guy who's identifying all this cheating he's a pain in the butt, right? And then so he literally he gave me, I think, 2 or 3 universities in Spain that he, I don't know, was friends with. Officials there. He's going to say, why don't you go to Spain? Just leave Guatemala, go to Spain, and do your master's degree there. And I didn't want to do that. I'm going, I don't want to go to Spain. Just this is ridiculous. And then Tulane, I think, was even almost worse, because they knew there was a problem. And I even had a photo of people, but just like literally of the exam being passed around in class. And I sent that to them, and I said, I just said, what are you going to do about this? And they said they weren't going to prosecute anyone or bring any kind of punishment, because it would just be too difficult because of so many people doing it. How would you even, it would be just administratively, it'd be very complicated.
You can't shut the college down.
You can't shut the program down. But I think it showed to me that, and this is one of the tough things about moving from the high trust society to a low trust one, that it kind of broke my heart, because in New Zealand, our reflex is to trust people, at least when I was growing up. And I just kind of have lost that. I've lost that trust of other people. Yeah. And where am I going with this? The university, Tulane, I realize now that they are, I think struggling financially. And the business school there struggles because people typically go to business school to get jobs in that area, right? So the local companies will come and hire people from the local business school. So even if a school is not so prestigious, let's say you go to University of Utah in Salt Lake City, it doesn't really matter, because you're right next to all the firms, right? The companies that are there will come and hire you. Whereas in Tulane, you might be supposedly prestigious, but no businesses are being started in New Orleans. I hate to say it. It's just a really struggling town.
Yeah.
So, and they even tried to open up a branch in Houston to deal with this problem. So they opened up a kind of like a business school franchise out there, but that closed down too. But so I just realized that Tulane, they were cutting corners and basically just selling degrees to a bunch of cheating Guatemalans. And I think they're well aware of this, and they just accept it because they're trying to make some money. And I learned later, because you learn along the way, but I learned later that Tulane had been cheating on the numbers it had been submitting to rankings, right?
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, so when you apply to business school, right, you set up a profile, and when you're ready, you submit the application, right? And in order to make themselves look more impressive, anyone who set up a profile was considered to have applied, right? And that meant that they had approved, let's say, admitted something like 50% of people, when in reality, that admitted something like 95% of people. If all the people actually pressed the submit button, 95% had been admitted to the program, and they have been tricking the rankings. And I just realized that other schools do this. Fox Business School at Temple in Philadelphia has been caught doing this. And I just realized that this cheating wasn't just in Guatemala, that Tulane was basically aware of this and just kind of tolerated it because it was people were basically buying degrees from them. And in the short run, their brand name carries. But in the long run, I think the whole higher education sector is realizing that their credibility is just going down at a rapid clip.
Yeah. I think so too. And I don't know where higher education goes in the coming years, but it'll be interesting to watch. So two more questions I want to ask you. One of them, you're now living in the U.S. You're a permanent resident, right?
Yeah.
So why did you choose to put down roots here in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, I've got to admit, mate, I don't really have roots here, right? So it's my family back in New Zealand, but I came at a young age, and so I acquired the American way of thinking. But my basic view is that if you share, let's say, the kind of liberty patriot view. I mean, one of my best friends here literally manufactures gun parts and is about as intense, like a liberty patriot gunman as you can find. I love the guy. You just don't have people like that. They just don't exist elsewhere in the world. It's a very American thing. Gun rights, free speech, even like I also identify homeschooling, this sort of belief in independent education. There's nowhere on the planet that has this kind of culture. The closest might be Alberta in Canada, right? Because Alberta is the one province where a bunch of Americans basically moved up to. And it's kind of like the Texas of Canada. And some of them want to secede, which I support. But in general, there just is no place that even comes close. So I give one data point is that the Anglosphere, the English-speaking countries, are the most friendly to homeschooling in the world. And however, about 5%, maybe even 6%, I think, since COVID, of American students are homeschooled now. As far as I know, well, the data that I have, elsewhere, it does not even crack 1%. If you go to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, nowhere cracks 1%. Now, I think in Alberta, the province of Canada, it cracks 1%, but over the nation, it does not, right? So I just think that if you want to be alongside people who have any sense of self-rule, this is the place to be. I mean, so for example, if you want to opt out of conventional medicine and just find alternative practitioners, I mean, good luck doing that in Canada. It doesn't exist, basically, right? And here in the United States, you can still do that. You can still say, I don't want to buy any government insurance, and you guys even advertise some kind of alternative to this.
Crowd health.
Yeah, crowd health. So there are ways out of that. Whereas in New Zealand, we have socialized medicine. You're paying for it whether you like it or not. And so, but I don't say that. I mean, I just feel like there are so many challenges here. I don't want to say the US is some kind of panacea or oasis, but I've written at length that the challenges elsewhere are even more difficult. The reason for leaving the United States, in my case, would more be to have a tighter community, right? So because I have no family here, it's a bit of a confusing scenario. So I have looked to move, like to kind of go back, because my grandparents were immigrants, my mother was an immigrant, and that leaves me a bit confused, right? So I've looked at reversing that and going back to Ireland, where my grandparents came from, where I have all my mother's cousins and lots of family, and kind of like a heritage or legacy that I relate to. It almost feels like my childhood, right? And I have considered it, but yes, economically it would be a big nosedive, but you would trade that for a tighter community.
Yeah, but with the ability to work remotely, maybe economic nosedive can be mitigated a bit.
I like there's some truth to that. But let's say, for example, you get a PhD in finance. I've looked to do a PhD in finance, but I've seen it advertised, a PhD tenure track position, for $75,000 in Northern Ireland, right? That same position would be $200,000 here in the United States.
Yeah.
Right. And this observation, the disparities are large. Plus, you'd be taxed more over there. So, good times. One of my friends who's from Turkey, she came to the United States and got her PhD at the University of South Carolina, and she wanted to go to Europe, but she said it was basically a 2/3 cut to the salary she would face. And she went and taught at the University of El Paso, Texas, which is not prestigious or anything, but they pay 3 times as much as let's say the University of Vienna, which is the one she was considering over there. Mm-hmm. So there really is, and a lot of Americans take this for granted or don't realize there's much more prosperity here, right? So, and you've got to think too about the long term. Okay, so let's say I've built up all these clients and relationships here in the United States, and I go to Ireland and I can keep there's a bit of inertia there. What about my children, right? What's their potential? So it just is the case that the US is markedly more economically successful than almost anywhere else in the world. I mean, there are some examples like Singapore or whatever that compete, but especially for a country of this size, it's almost, it's a real outlier in its success. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
yeah.
I think in the United States, obviously people like you and I, we track the policy and, the tax structure, all that stuff very closely, much more closely than, 99% of people probably. But like when you look at the opportunity that still exists in the U.S., even if Kamala Harris would have been elected president, obviously that would have been bad. Things would have gotten worse from a tax standpoint, from a freedom, probably ease of starting a business standpoint. But when comparing that to the rest of the world, probably still in a better place.
Absolutely. So the top 1% of Americans make more than $500,000 a year, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in Canada, it's something like 220,000. It's really a huge difference that if you're a go-getter in the United States, you still can do much better than elsewhere. Further, my next book is going to be about business school. Right after this whole experience in Guatemala, I became intrigued with the business school world. And why can U.S. business schools charge $130,000, $150,000 for an MBA? It is insane, right? It's a huge amount of money because they are basically gatekeepers to corporate America.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if I could go to the top university in Ireland and get an MBA for $30,000, right? It's because, or to Switzerland, or even the best countries in Europe, because the US has such a more lucrative labor market, right? If you go to Stanford, I think they make something like $260K starting on average, getting out of those MBA programs.
Mm-hmm.
No other country on the planet could even come close to competing with that for an MBA graduate, right? So the US labor market is much more lucrative. And in the case for guys like you and me, who don't want to have necessarily conventional jobs or, want to do broader things, the opportunity for small businessmen, the opportunities are incredible. I mean, there's so many little like avenues you can pursue still. And I just see that as, let's say, much more available than, let's say, going to Canada or Australia or New Zealand. There's still a big disparity there. So, but like I said, to me, the big reason for going elsewhere would be for community. If you care about economics, then the US is the place to be. It just so happens that my community over the last 15, 20 years has been this kind of liberty-minded group of people. Mm-hmm. And so they've become almost like a de facto family. But we will make compromises. So you live in Pennsylvania, as far as I know, and I live in Colorado. These are not New Hampshire or Wyoming, right?
Right.
We could, I literally could just move 45 minutes up the road to Cheyenne and pay no state income tax and pay a lower sales tax and cut probably 40% off my housing costs, right? So we all make these compromises to live in a place we just enjoy more, where we mm-hmm. feel more comfortable. So in many ways, I mean, that's why I say to people too, that even if Latin America looks appealing at first glance, I just think there's much more to it. It's like, people trying to date on a dating app or something like that. There are many intangibles that go beyond the screen. And I'm one of the red pill elements of the book is just that there's a side of Latin America that is less appealing. I mean, I'm not saying no one should go there or anything like that, and I discuss for whom it would make sense, but the people who are selling property or expatriation services or passport services or whatever it may be, they have no incentive to tell you this. And I don't want to name names, but I do think there are perverse incentives at play. Yeah.
So, a little twist for the last question here. You spent a lot of time in Latin America. What, in your opinion, what was your favorite part? What was the most appealing aspect of living in Latin America?
Actually, I should have, because in many ways, John, I had a great time. I look back, it was an adventure. Because if you're a young guy who has I had basically nothing, no family, I was just a young guy exploring the world, it was a great time, right? So, and I should mention too, I didn't really know what to say about the crime, but there are parts of Latin America that do have crime much more akin to what you'd find in let's say a place like Pennsylvania or in Canada. Uruguay is the most notable example. Chile, to some degree, would have lower crime too. But so I really had a wonderful time in Argentina with just great friends, because I think there was again a kind of a companionship with in Spanish we just say the liberal community, like the classical liberal community. And I miss them a lot. I miss those good friends, and they'll be friends for life. I get messages from them always saying, come on back, Ferg. And so I think the relationships I acquired were the best. That's the most meaningful element. And let me try and finish on a positive. As you say, there are many good aspects of Latin America that maybe, would advantage, again, someone like me. There's way less political correctness, right? So things like being called, like this whole gender ideology that almost does not even exist in Latin America, right? Maybe in Argentina a bit, but in general, it's kind of not a thing. And so there's less political correctness, and there's more of maybe there are tighter families and communities where if you meet someone, it's a bit more like when I was growing up, that you kind of have friendships that will last for a lifetime, like I say, whereas I feel like sometimes in the United States, because we're such a rootless people in this country, we don't have that. Yeah. So like you said, the friendships and the lack of political correctness, I love it. So that's why there's kind of like an irony to this book, like the Latin America Red Pill, that a lot of them, they would agree with this book, and they're my buddies. It's kind of like it's a kind of a funny scenario, because especially the entrepreneurs, I mean, we're like bosom buddies. It's like because they're the ones who are being attacked. Like that's why they're quite happy for someone me to be writing about them, because I'm standing up for the private sector, who are always demonized by the anti-capitalist electorate.
Yeah.
And so and that's why there's a kind of like a 20% portion of the Latin American electorate who now are like, they're super Trump supporters or whatever. They're really pro-America, and I know a lot of them. So yeah, I'm trying to think what else, mate. I mean, I will admit I have my fridge is basically, don't tell, I mean, no one here come and expect some, but I've got a whole bunch of this chocolate from Honduras, which is just the greatest. And so, so I got fat in Argentina eating empanadas, and I got fat in Honduras eating too much chocolate. So that, like, you kind of find the good things. I mean, I've actually looked to import the chocolate, because they have what's called single origin chocolate, which is, so all the ingredients come from Honduras. Like they'll have the sugar grown right there and the cocoa right there. They just like make it on the spot. And of course, when you buy it from, there's a place in Boulder here in Colorado that makes chocolate. I mean, who knows where the stuff comes from? It's just kind of all generic. But when you get it from one farm, the flavor is so kind of unified or crisp. and I'm a big chocolate connoisseur now after all this time.
Oh,
And
yeah.
people who like coffee, I'm not sure, are you a coffee man?
I love coffee. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you go to Colombia, for example, they're so proud of it because they grow a ton of coffee there.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were like, I'm a chocolate man, but if you're a coffee guy, I think you would love too the kind of like the rich, the fresh coffee from the area. There's actually a coffee park, like a Disney World devoted to coffee in Colombia, Parque Nacional de Café, like the National Park of Coffee, and it's great. You know, they have bumper boats and everything.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So, mate, I mean, so that's one of the things that obviously when you're a journalist, you don't write these kind of feel-good stories so much. It's more just kind of drama and crisis. And, you know, I've got this photo from Caracas, Venezuela, which is just a disaster. But that unfortunately does overshadow the many great experiences you have and the many people who have welcomed you into their homes. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. Just one more note. Speaking of Caracas, Venezuela, I used to work in oil and gas, and the company I worked for used to have a lot of assets in Venezuela before the nationalization of that industry. And when that happened, essentially the government came in with guns and they said, you can either work for us or you can leave. And a lot of people decided they wanted to leave, and the company I work for brought those people back to the United States, which I thought was really, really cool. And a lot of them still work for that company. So I got an interesting view into that dynamic and the stories that they share of like planning to leave the country. And they had the two of the guys met. This is after they're, basically run out of the factory, and they're meeting for coffee, and they had all these documents that they were sharing with each other, and the one spilled coffee all over them.
Actually, there's one of the, I mean, there's lots I could say, John, and maybe just quickly, do you want to tell me, have you ever considered expatriating from the United States?
Not seriously. I mean,
yeah,
it's crossed my mind for sure, but much like when you were talking about family and maybe going back to Ireland, my immediate family, my parents and my wife's parents are right here outside of Pittsburgh. My brother and sister, they're in other parts of the country. But at least at this point in my life right now, I think I'm set here for the next few years. But after that, I don't know. We'll see how things unfold. It's something that who knows what happens.
Yeah, because there's a friend of mine here in Colorado. He just moved to Australia, and I thought, what?
I wouldn't do that.
yeah. I was kind of shocked, but basically he told me that he did, I think, a year of high school or university down there. So that gave him this kind of like taste, and he just wanted to go back and I guess revitalize that. But there's one other thing about the lack of political correctness in Latin America. Now, this is changing to some degree, but in my opinion, there is, more, let's say, reverence towards family and especially towards women. Mm-hmm. I know this is not necessarily a positive aspect of it, but if you are Miss Colombia, I mean, you're the biggest celebrity in the country, basically. It's just they really revere this feminine beauty. And so, and for example, they still have the quinceañera. That's a very common party. And I just think it's a beautiful thing that there's basically a celebration that a girl is becoming a woman that we don't have. We don't have this reverence towards femininity, which has been
not
lost.
Only don't we have it, it's been attacked in this country.
Sure, I mean you could describe it that way. That it's beyond. It's like not just ignoring it. It's going against it. Yeah. So
exactly.
So that's. I mean, I don't talk about it in the book, but it really did strike me. I've been to a bunch of quinceañeras, and it's such a beautiful occasion to see a father dance with his daughter and kind of like introduce her, present her to the world. And historically, that was basically saying she's now eligible for suitors or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so there still are many aspects of Latin society that we could learn from, basically.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Well, I think this was a really interesting episode for a lot of people. I know we had David chime in. Interesting subject. Thank you for watching, and then following along here, David. I so much I get caught up in talking about Brian and I talking about the politics of the United States, and it was a nice breath of fresh air to look outside of our walls here in the U.S. and talk about Latin America and what's happening, because I think it's all interrelated, especially as technology makes us all so much closer today than ever before. So thanks for coming on the show, Fergus. And I want you to, before you go, tell people where they can find the book and any parting words or any thoughts, any things I didn't ask you about that you want to share with my audience.
Well, this is the book, Latin America Red Pill, and Amazon.com or Amazon.ca if you're in Canada. But my parting word is just that I hope that the young libertarians learn from guys like you, John, who have been doing this for a long time, and take seriously the lessons that I've had to kind of learn the hard way, to not just be a shouting ideologue, and try to be a bit more, I don't know, holistic in the way you view the world, or have a bit more nuance. And that's where, like I said, I really appreciate that a lot of the libertarians who've grown up like you are now trying to promote, let's say, strong families, or just work productivity, good values. I think these things can be lost amid the noise of just people complaining about policies.
Mm-hmm. 100%. Well, Fergus, thanks for coming on the show. We'll have to do this again sometime soon.
Anytime, John. Cheers.
I'm sure. Well, you're working on another book, so when that comes out, we'll have you back on.
Cheers.
All right, Fergus.
See you guys.
Bye.
See you guys.
All right. Well, that is a wrap for today's show with Fergus Hodgson. I really enjoyed that. I have the book right here, and want to recommend that you all go out and check this out for yourself. I'll put the link, the Amazon link, on the show notes page for you to pick it up. One last plug, guys. One last plug. Join the Lions of Liberty Pride. We want you in the Lions of Liberty Pride. You can get bonus content, bunch of other stuff, merchandise. And right now, if you join as an annual member, you're going to get this beauty right here, this mug. That's right. If you can see it, a Lions of Liberty Christmas mug. It's an awesome logo. I love this. It's the old school Lions of Liberty logo. You can see Lions of Liberty on the bottom there in Christmas colors. Christmas hat on the lion. Plus, we're going to throw in this miniature coaster and a Christmas magnet as well. All that stuff was manufactured by our friend Jason. Jason over at Horrible Designs. So just one more time to say it. The way to get it, you join the Pride as an annual member, any level, or you join the Pride at $25 or up level, our Mufasa level, and you will get the mug. That's all I got. I'll be back next week with another awesome guest. In the meantime, always remember to keep your head up and the fires of liberty burning.